Okay, hello everybody. On behalf of IBM, welcome to Domino Policy's Deep Dive in Best Practices. First, my background. I've been with IBM since January 3rd, 95, so this marks 19 years. I first contributed to Lowe's Domino on R5. That was message reporting and iSpy mail and IP monitoring task. I took over the policies area in about 8.5. And now a couple years, about 4 years, I'm the Domino administration team lead. When I say the Domino, the policy area owner, what that really means is there's really three components to that. There's the Domino directory, there's the policy engine, and then there's the individual settings. And the way it works is that the template teams own the directory, I own the engine, and then the individual area owners own the individual settings, of which there's currently about 1,000 settings. So I try to put in my abstract, and putting it as a disclaimer here is that we're not going to talk about settings much at all. And the main reason for that is that I think there's other presentations that have been done in years past. I have one from Darren Duke listed here. And what I wanted to do, because a lot of other presentations have focused on particular areas like, say, ID Vault or iNotes, managing your different features that way. And I wanted to focus on policies at a higher level. Because I found when I first took over the policy space that there's a lot of confusion on it. And so since then, I've tried to create a lot of wikis and done a lot of documentation effort. And so today I wanted to talk about it at that level. That being said, just for the people who would probably ask during the question and answer, there's been 36 new settings in 901, mostly Traveler. There's about 75 new settings in 9.0. If there is any particular setting you are interested in, please come down to the lab after the session. If I don't know it, I don't know them all. There's probably another area expert, let's say security, that I can help you out and work with. And why the session, as I said, I think policy is very powerful, but like a Swiss Army knife. When I was a Boy Scout, I got a Swiss Army knife, and I thought, great. And then I was bewildered by the 45 things I could, that were on it and didn't know how to do anything with it. This is an attempt to try to remove some of that confusion regarding policies. So what's our agenda? We're going to do a deep dive. That's really a lot of the architecture. We're going to do 2 flow examinations of how policy gets to the client and how policy comes down to the server for like mail, travel, or iNotes. I want to talk a bit about the precedence and scope. I think one of the most confusing parts about policies, and then some other small little tidbits about the how to apply controls. I think the meat today will be about best practices, and then I'll finish up with using policies in the cloud. There's only like 2 slides on that, but it's an important topic, and I just wanted to highlight for people who maybe aren't in the cloud yet but are thinking about going there. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So for the deep dive, this is the general architecture. There's 3 main circles: the standard client, the admin client, and the Domino server. We're not going to focus much on the admin client today, but the only thing that we know there is that the policy synopsis database is local to that. On the standard client, it's a little busy. You have the C++ parts, which is the notes executable. Most important part is the personal nav, where all the policies are stored locally. Then you have dying config, which is the actual part of notes that brings down the policies, along with any other dying config related settings. Then you have the Java side, when we added the composite Java. That's notes 2. And that has its own private store of settings called managed settings. So there's a different API for that, and that's consumed by things like plugins. On the server side, we have the Domino directory, of course, starting point for everything. Then we have, within a policy thread, the policy engine. It's not really an engine per se. It's not a separate component. It's really just a collection of code that gets invoked when the policies are fetched. You have the policy cache, that if a policy has already been fetched once, we don't recalculate it again. We use it in the cache. And then you have admin P. And admin P is a part that actually drives the policies to the mail file. So those are the 3 major areas. So on the client-side policy flow, I moved the admin client just to make it cleaner, and we're going to walk through this step by step. So the first thing that we do is that we read the dynamic information, the dying config info from the local nav, and that's qualified by the directory profile and the username. And this is an important part, because basically the way the whole policy update works, or any of the client configuration on the client side works, is there's hashes that are stored in this profile. That includes things like, if you have to update your internet password, if you have to, do a mail file move for a person. These hashes are exchanged between the server and the client and the server upon connection. And if there's a mismatch, flags come back. And that tells dyneconfig basically to do work. That's the starting point of the whole flow. The next thing is obvious. You have to access your home mail. Now, I have the word home highlighted in red because there's some subtleties on that have confused people, and I'll talk more about that later. But just for now, just focus on you have to access the home mail server to get the settings. So during authentication, the hashes get recalculated. The server side will basically pull the information from the Domino directory, calculate what it thinks the hash should be. It will compare it with what the client passed over. And then if there's a mismatch, it will send a flag back on the session. So everything happens during that session authentication. After that, the client then stores them off for the next time it connects to the server. If there was any flags telling it to do work, in this case a policy pull, it will launch dyneconfig. And then the first thing dyneconfig does, it goes back to the PNAB and fetches what's called the policy types. We have the 6 standard policy types like setup, desktop, mail, security. But every time we added a new policy type, there was a lot of work. We had to go change a lot of pieces of code. So I think it was 8.0, we added what's called extended policy types, where we have things like roaming, traveler. And what it does, it goes to here to find what is the current list of known policy types. And right now there's 10. So it goes through there, finds that, and for each one, it will now do a fetch. So yeah, so if you have, so that's actually 10 fetches for all the 10 different types. It'll first check the cache. If it's not in the cache, it'll pull it from the directory, and it'll send the effective policy back to the client. Then it stores it. One thing to understand that at this point, you basically shifted the policy location to the client. The true end user of any policy setting is the function or area that uses it, whether it's security checking, your password expiration, or mail doing, how often should you put mail. So this is not the final destination. In certain cases like security, your actual ID contains some security information. Then after all those 10 are pulled, it notifies the Java side. The Java side fetches the policy that was just pulled over there, and also what's called the how to apply. The true effective policy has 2 pieces. It has the piece from the personal NAB, and then it has also another profile called the HCA profile. And what that takes care of things like set initial. When you set initial, the first time it's going to take that information, scroll it away in the HTA profile so that it knows the next time not to include that one. So you really need both those 2 pieces of information to have your true effective policy, and that's calculated, like I said, when you actually have part of the code suck it in. Well, but Java does it a little different. It does it all directly, and then stores it in the managed settings space. And that way, so any Java plugins will be pulling from there, actually, not from the personal NAB. And then lastly, you get the happy message that the node's configuration settings have been refreshed. Now, there's a little confusion on this because this message can come out for any dyneconfig update. One of the most common dyneconfig update is what's called the local update. So when you first bring up your client and haven't connected to any server, you're going to see this come up, and that's because there's some local changes done by dyneconfig. If you then go and connect to your home server and you do need a policy, then you'll see this again. So sometimes I've had people say, well, I've seen the node's configuration message. I should have my policies. If you've seen it twice, then you had it. If you've only seen it once, probably not. The other thing I just want to mention about that is, as you can see, there's a lot of steps involved. So that's why when some people have policy issues, we have to kind of trace all these steps back in all the different paths to make sure that all the pieces are there. Now, on the server side, things are much, much simpler. Every 12 hours, admin P will calculate the effective mail policy for the users. You can override this with the I9 that I have listed there. Now, the reason why it's every 12 hours is because potentially you're going to go through touch every mail file on the server, and that can be expensive. So when admin P runs, it tries to determine who's actually been updated and only update those people, so therefore it's being more efficient. So if you do tweak the poll interval, keep an eye on your server to make sure you're not doing it too frequently and having issues. There is a tell command to admin P process mail that will force an update. That happens for every mail user on that server. So that's a big heavy hitter. Now maybe you have a process where, let's say, some off-peak period, you do all your policy updates. And then you want to make sure that they've been pre-positioned as best you can. You could use a program record, for example, to do this command and say, 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning, run that on every mail server so you know the policies have gone out there. And then lastly, storage it in the calendar profile. So obviously, much simpler, 2 steps. Other policies besides mail are involved here, or traveler. iNotes comes down here. And one step is actually missing from all of this, which is also important, is, as I said, this is the home mail server. The policies start on your admin server of your domain. And sometimes I've had customers have issues. It's actually between the admin server and the home mail server. And one of the other common questions is, well, how long is it going to take? Well, it's going to be, what's your replication interval from your admin server to your hub, your mail server? Do you have a hub and spoke? Is it complicated? Is it international? Then when the policies come down, the views have to be updated. So as you can see, there's a lot of things that get involved in that. So there's not a simple answer on that timeline. One of the things I wanted to highlight about mail policies as well is that I've often been told, oh, well, my mail policy came down to my client, and I go to my mail preferences, and I don't see anything. I don't see the affected change. That's because it's getting it from the mail file on the server. As I said, the client gets all 10 policy types, but it doesn't mean it consumes them all there. So here you see, if you hit more, go to the mail file, it then brings them up. The other thing is that this UI is sticky. What that means is, if I have my client up, change a policy, forced admin P on the mail server, and went back in that UI, it would still have the old settings. It's because you have to restart the client. That's just a particular nuance about the mail policy preferences. Other preferences can be different. But it's just an important thing to understand. The next thing that I mentioned earlier about the home server. And this also creates a lot of confusion. Here I have the location document of a person, and then I have the location document of a person, and then the person document in the download directory. The client gets its home server from location document. A lot of people assume it's from whatever's in your person document in the server is it. It's not the case. That's very important, and I'll show you a little bit why. Show you why even more in a little bit. So the server gets it from there. So basically, admin P on the server for mail, iNotes Traveler, it's getting it from the person document. The client's different. And they may be different. Once again, that can be useful when debugging issues. Now, so when you switch locations, a lot of people often do, mainly admins. If you switch to a different location that's to a different domain, because of what I just said, you could get policies from another domain. You have to have a person document in there, or you have to have a hierarchical name in there, but you could switch. Now, if you're hosting other domains and you have special IDs for each domain, and therefore you're switched, then you're okay. But it's just something to be aware of, that if you're seeing some funkiness there, you might want to check that out. The last thing is that the mail server listed in your location document must be canonical. Now, if you go into the UI and you edit that server in the normal UI, it's going to get saved correctly. But we had a case where a customer was using third-party client management software and was setting that value, and it was setting to the abbreviated name. But all of a sudden, policies weren't coming down. So we tweaked that actually so that now if it goes in there, doesn't work, it will try the canonical name, and then it will save it and update it in there to correct that, so nobody else has to run into that. But you could put other bad things in there, like the host name or an IP thing, IP address. What you need to have in there is the regular canonicalized name that you have in the server document. Now, this is a little bit of precedence and scope. There are 3 policy types: organizational, dynamic, and explicit, and they have increasing precedence, which means they win, and the policy battle for which setting comes into play. It's actually kind of decreasing scope. So organizational can affect everybody, dynamic, a group or some N number, and explicit could be in theory 1. So the best, I think, guide was always used is use the one that matches your scope. Sometimes people worry about precedence a lot and thinking, well, how do I make sure that this one wins? And I say, don't worry about that. Worry about how many people you're trying to affect. And that's going to guide you on which type to use. And you may need several different layers in order to get your desired effect and apply the same rule to each layer. I have a detailed article on this because if we dove into this, it would probably take another 15 minutes to a half an hour because it gets very involved. So I have a detailed article of this on the wiki. And one other source of confusion is we look to a policy, master policy document, creating a new policy, and you go to see the type. There's only two listed, explicit and organizational. So this creates a lot of confusion. There's no dynamic. And why is that? Well, a dynamic is an explicit policy that has users groups in the policy assignment tab. And explicit policy has none. So that's why the naming convention. So if you get confused, if you look at some of the cloud presentations, they say they only have explicit. It's the same. It's just a little semantic difference here. What's actually a little bit more confusing is you actually could have one policy be both. Because you could have a policy with people in sign, and you could assign the same policy to an individual person. Maybe you want to do that if you want to test out. You haven't used the policies before. You could try that, but that's just a. So don't be confused. Think the NEC policies as groups, an explicit person document that keep things a little more clear. I've come across a common policy pattern when a lot of people deploy their policies. Organizational-wide, use organizational policies for the big settings, things like, say, password expiration. And then people tend to then focus on, well, I want to enable a new feature like iNotes or ID Vault or Mail Managed Replica. And then you tend to create the NEC policies for that. And then, of course, whenever you roll out a whole new feature, there's always somebody who says, I don't want to touch that yet. So then usually you have what I would call an exception. And in that case, you could use an explicit or also a dynamic as well. Well, that's just a very common thing. We tend to have very few organizationals in general, a lot more clusters of policies that are dynamic for individual feature sets, and then the exceptions. Another issue when trying to work with the precedence of scope, and once again, part of the Swiss Army knife issue, is the inherit and enforce settings. I think people are most familiar with the enforce settings, which is basically you're forcing that setting down through any other layer in the precedence stack. And it kind of inverts the precedence thing, because if you do an enforce at the organizational level, you've just wiped everything else down. Less commonly used is the inherit from parent. And sometimes you can use that in a case where, for example, let's say you have distributed administration. So you have different regional people have control over their own local policies. And let's say you do have, let's say, the password expiration. There's no official company policy yet. What you can do is you can set the value, and then if and mark it as inherit. And if the future, if there ever is a corporate policy, it'll pull it down. Where if you just left it the way it is, that policy being more having higher precedence would win. So that's kind of how you can layer them. Okay, the next one is the how to apply controls. Don't set gets a lot of confusion. It does not mean use a default value. It means for the purpose of that policy layer, when it gets processed by the policy engine, it doesn't exist. There's no default value. It just doesn't exist. So one best practice is kind of to, if you're not going to use a setting, set it to don't set. And then that way you're only getting the setting that you explicitly wanted. Set initial is the next one, and that's used for an initial deployment. Often, obviously, setup. In fact, when set initial is added, well, actually, when the HCA controls were added, the whole setup policy wasn't really needed. I mean, it's there and present so that people have existing backward version will still support it. But basically, a dynamic desktop policy with set initial for everything is exactly equivalent to what the old setup policy was. The most commonly used control is a set whenever modified. After all, using a policy because you want to control the settings, so whenever it changes, that'll get pushed. And as a little additional flavor on that is the set and prevent changes, and that locks down those controls. Now, you might go into a policy, and you see, in certain cases, you see a don't set value checkbox, or you see the drop-down. And it might seem willy-nilly as to why some have it and some don't. And what the real reason is what's called admin only. Everything that has just don't set means only the admin can control that. There's no user interface for that. So in this example, here we have, can you do message recall versus allow somebody to? So the users allowed is admin only. On the other one, it has an end user UI, which I've shown below. So if you ever wondered why that is, that's what it is. So don't be looking for any admin only UIs on the client side. Okay, best practices. This might seem a little glib, but it's, is there a published set of best practices? And I say this is it. And I've been asked several times, well, what is IBM's best practices with policies? And it's always been very hard to give an answer because you're talking a customer set of maybe a 5-server company, a large multinational company that has centralized admin versus a large multinational that has decentralized admin. And have a true set of best practices that covers all of them is, once again, Swiss Army knife, very tough to do. So what I've tried to capture here is the ones that I think are truly universal. The first one, probably the obvious one, is use the least amount. Now, it might seem obvious, but one of the biggest issues I've done quite a few reviews where I've taken a customer's download directory, reviewed all their policies. And very often I've seen just large numbers of policies usually because they don't understand precedence. So the problem there is that if you do that, then you're going to increases your TCO, because if you have to change a setting, you have to change in every policy document or settings document that you've changed. So reducing that makes that more important. And if you do have an organizational policy, once again, this has been very common. I had a customer that had about 80 policies, and they had a 3-level hierarchy. They had a policy at every level and a settings document at every level, and almost all of them were most part the same. So we were able to remove some of that, either by having it at an org level. You could also reuse the same settings document. And I think we got down to like 21 or 14 policies in the end. One other thing to remember is policies should always be modified to the admin server of the domain. And that's always a standard practice actually for any download configuration. But I just wanted to reinforce that here, because some people have, once again, thinking of the home mail server, have changed policy settings there when diagnosing an issue. Maybe there's a replication issue back, and now they're confused. So always change them there. We added auto-populated groups in 8.5, and we've used it a lot internally, as you'll see. And what we do here is that in order to make things simpler, we create an auto-populated group for every home mail server that we have. Then our servers are clustered, so we create a group that contains that auto-populated group from each cluster. Then we create a group that contains all the clusters. Now you don't have to use auto-populated group for policies. I think it's very highly leveraged with policies, but you can use it for ACLs and other things. And it kind of looks like this. You have your home server, the cluster, and the collection of clusters. And you actually can see this when you do a policy synopsis. This is one I did for me this morning. And you see on the far right in the red box, part and home server, that's my mail server. That's the magic mirror as my cluster. And then Iris domain is our entire domain. So that's how you actually can see the decomposition of your dynamic policies there. One other thing I wanted to comment on here is that the top part where you see the hierarchical name decomposition, if it's in blue, you can click on it. Anything in blue in the policy synopsis, you can click on, and you'll take it to wherever it's connected to. And in this case, the policies or policy settings document. If you ever see a black item, which is only in the hierarchical part, it means there's nothing there. So in this case, if */IBM was black, there's no actual policy to click there. Now, how is this helpful? One example is, you have a new customer, a new employee comes in. You register them, you put them on a mail server. The auto-populated group runs. That runs on the admin server domain. Adds them to the home mail server group. Next thing you know, they have everything. You didn't have to do anything to get them configured with policies. Same thing if you have an employee that moves to an international assignment. And let's say you have regional-based download administration, different policies on their mail servers. You do the mail file move, person gets moved over, add to the new server, add to the new group. Once again, didn't have to change anything. So I'm going to talk about groups a bit used for policies. We also added the protected group feature. So you don't want to do all this work creating these groups and then have an admin fat finger and actually delete the whole group. We've also had customers where they would accidentally delete the local domain admins, replicate around the domain, and it was hard to recover. So, once again, if you do all the work for policies and doing groups, it's a good place to protect that work. This is a very important one. When you use dynamic policies, use groups as much as you can and not individual people. After all, the whole idea of using a dynamic policy was to prevent using explicit policies where you had to go into the person document of every individual person documents. So if you put all your people in there, it kind of defeats the purpose. The second thing is that there's a performance reason for that. Before we just had it organizational and explicit, it was very simple. You would get the explicit from the person document, and the organizational one was just the hierarchical name decomposition. Now you have groups. I've seen customers with like 60, 80 groups for an individual person. So what happens is that you have your names list that comes in on your session authentication, and then you have this view here called $policies by group. And it has to take the intersection of all the groups in your names list and all the entries here to get your intersected list and pull the policy from that and then do the precedence at that point. So if you have a lot of individual names, you could have your whole, basically your whole employee list in this view to go through every time. That's not very efficient. So how do you know that? You can go to the hidden view, Control-Shift-View, go to, look at the view, and then see if you have individual users. Now, clearly, we're not saying never to use any individual users. There's a lot of cases when you want, but just, don't make a large habit of it. The policy synopsis tool, why is it best practice? It is the #1 thing that I use to debug issues. I said I'm the policy area expert, so if there's ever a PMR in the future, I'm the person who gets it in the end. The first thing I will always ask is, give me a policy synopsis from the user's home mail server. Because the code, policy engine code, is exactly the same. It's invoked exactly the same for the policy synopsis for the end user client. So if there's an issue there, there's an issue there in the client. Sometimes if the home mail server is incorrect, and once again, you can do the same thing on the admin server, that would tell you if you have a replication issue between the two. You also can use it, you think of the Domino servers, how they're configured, right? You have server documents, you have server configuration documents. In server configuration documents, you can do a star, you can do groups, you can do individual names. But there's no tool that will tell you in the end, okay, for server X, what's my configuration? That's basically what the policy synopsis does. So if you haven't used policies and you're a little nervous about what my end result is going to be, you could go into a test domain, just create any policy you want, run the synopsis, and see if you get what you expect. And it will show you where the policies come from, and you can click through it. You can launch it from one of two places. There's the people and groups view, the admin client. You can right-click on there and get it that way. There's also a lesser-known area in the configuration tab. The only difference there is that instead of there's no person to click on, you have to enter in a username. That's actually how we use it in the Smart Cloud nodes, because in the service, there's no people in our service directory. That's a typically directory server. So you have to enter it in that way. But it's just, instead of trying to find a person, it might be faster to use it the other way. If you do, let's say, have a production policy issue and you want to put it into a test environment to debug it more, and you copy your policies, you have to relink them. The way it works is policies, the master policy, have the UNID of the settings documents listed there. So when you do a copy and paste, new UNIDs in a new database, it's all broken. So you just have to go in through, open them, reconnect them, then you're good. Also important to know, if you have a PMR, that very often I'll ask for an OS level copy of the directory minus any security, private information. But sometimes I'll get a copy and then it's broken. So it's just a good thing to also know from that level. There's also what I call the set initial trap. I'll often get a call, customer, we're configuring some new setting. It worked the first time, then it stopped working. And I always say, go check your HCA and set initial. So once again, it's used primarily just for setup. So if you have a one and done situation, check that setting. Removing a policy. You have to remember that policies are a push model. So for example, if you have the company has a default mail check interval of 5 minutes, and then you push a policy of 1 minute. That goes out, and now everybody's hitting your server a lot more than you thought, and you're hurting the server. So you want to push it back, so you panic, you just delete it. It's still there. So what you have to do in that case is you have to re-push the policy and set it to whatever value that you wanted. Let's say in this case 5 minutes. And you let that replicate out. Once everything calms down, instead of even deleting it, what I often suggest is to disable it. So if it's a dynamic policy, you can just go in and obviously just clear out the policy assignment tab. Or if you don't want to do that, you can actually just rename the group in there just so it's not a valid group. Once again, that will disable it. And if it's the organizational policy, once again, you can just change the name to remove it. That way, if you wanted to try a rollout and then you have an issue, you can always bring it back real quick. We also do this a lot internally. We use our own admins as our guinea pigs. That way, if there's any issue, we get hit with it first. So also a good suggestion. One suggestion here is every policy document is signed, because since you're affecting end user machines, we can't have everybody going in there and changing those policy settings and causing havoc. So they're all signed. Every once in a while, you'll see what I call it the dreaded policy has modified since signed message. And what can happen with that is that you can have an admin, and the admin either leaves a company, in which case, if they delete him immediately, you can get this quickly, or if he's left in the Domino directory for some period of time until your password expiration time happens, all of a sudden you get all your policies are invalid. So if you have an ID that you use to do that signing and somebody leaves, then you don't have that problem. Now the only con of that is that you won't have in the updated by information, whoever changed made the last policy change. And we actually have this issue in the cloud. And what they do is that they actually sign the policies with the server ID. So they can easily tell by a glance, if there's anybody's username in there, then the policy's been modified and needs to be fixed. And they have a little tool they run that's specialized to them that will just update that particular policy with the server ID. People could do that, but separately, if you have your Domino directory locally, you could sign it that way. Now, let's say you are having an issue. How do you tell who signed it? The common thought is you go to the policies view, and there is the signed by column on the right side. It's actually not signed by, it's actually updated by. And that's, unfortunately, we should fix that. So how do you know? You actually open up the policy, and down by the location document on the far right side, there's a little tab. This looks kind of like a piece of paper, maybe with an inkwell. That's the signature encryption icon. So you go there and click on that. It brings up the document, and that tells you who actually signed the policy. So let's say you find out that there was a problem. It's not who you thought it was. Then you go, while you're in the policy view, there's the actions, resign policy, and then that'll go do that. Then you can rerun the signature icon and verify that that's what happened. I forget when this was added, but we added the machine-specific policies. This helps for things like when you're doing a laptop versus a desktop, you might be doing different settings if you're running Citrix. I think we only have a handful of actual settings that we have that ship with pre-built formulas for this. This is an example for one of them, which is the mailman replica issue, or setting. There's some documentation in there how to add new ones and also how to do troubleshooting. The most important thing to know is client only. Obviously, if you would run that on the server and try to do a laptop, you're going to get a different answer. So that's why it's client only. This is less of a best practice, but I just thought it was important to include in here as an extra tool. There's something called an exemption policy. It's on the administration tab of the policy, which says ignore settings from ancestor policies. I've only once had a customer actually use this, and where they actually did it for was that they had done a completely new policy setup. They pushed everything out, and they had a very nervous group of executives. So what I said was, if you do this, what it basically does is it cuts the precedence hierarchy right at that spot. So any of the previous settings that were there, that would say your organizational policies, they all get cut off, and only from that point down do the settings apply. So it's rarely used, but I just want to point it out there as a possibility. One of the other questions we get a lot is, how can I force a policy update? Well, from the server, you really only have two options. You can go into the person's document in the nav, do an edit and save, I call it during the document, and then they, once again, connect back into the home server, they'll get updated. But once again, if you change on the admin server of the domain, it has to replicate down to the mail server, update the view index, so it's, I've had QE come back and say, I did this test and it didn't work. Well, you have to wait for it. On the server side, there's three options, basically do the same thing. You can restart the server. In the cloud, we start every server every night. You can, on the command line, do the load updall here. You also can do, if you're in, let's say, the admin client or nodes client, just do a shift view, control shift on the view, and that will build the view index. And why does that work? Part of the logic of when a policy update has to happen is based on the modified time of the view. So that's how that works. On the client side, it used to be the case if you went in and deleted the policies from local PNAB, it would cause it. And it doesn't happen since 8.5. And the reason is that the little code that was trying to figure that out, what really was trying to do was watch the view and then update those hashes I mentioned before. It cleared them out to basically do an end around. The problem with that, because of how some semantics of how the NSF code in the back works, it was causing a policy update every time. So we're actually looking into see if we can find a way over a node session to resolve that so we can maybe pick that back up. But right now, so what you can do, if you're at the command prompt, you can do one-dyne config. Because I mentioned before, when I saw the whole initial client policy flow, after doing all that work to determine a policy update is needed, then dyne-config brought it down, there's that flag that comes down. What that would basically do, it circumvents the first half, and it says dyne-config, bring the policies down. And then the last method is that you could do a low strip button. And if you look at this, what it's doing is it's, once again, going to the directory profile and taking out the user's information. Once again, that goes back to those dynamic configuration hashes, and it's just clearing them out. So those are the methods that do it there. So for Smart Cloud Notes, once again, this only applies if you're a hybrid customer. If you're purely in the cloud, this doesn't apply. But if you're a hybrid, which I think is like 89% of our customers, then this is what you need to know. When you register you register as a company, in the service, they create an organizational policy for you. And in there, they have certain specific settings that are locked down that are for the service to run efficiently. And you can't, get past them. So only dynamic policies are supported, no organizational or explicit. Once again, I said there's confusion in what dynamic policy means versus explicit. So a lot of the Smart Cloud Notes code, you'll see explicit only, and then they'll qualify in a group, not in the person document. So once again, what I mean here is it's an explicit it's an explicit policy with people in groups specified. You can simulate organizational policies by using the wildcard hierarchy shown here. And once again, as I mentioned before, we prefer if you use groups whenever possible. All the policies are siloed for each customer, but once again, for performance-wise, it helps if everybody has their policies tweaked like that. There are some groups that are reserved. And the other thing is that your groups have to be unique across directories. So if you have multi-domains in your organization, I think you sync them in one domain or n number of domains at a time. You have to have your groups qualified in some way so they're unique to your organization. And then we don't support archiving, registration, roaming, and traveler. Desktop mail and security are supported with a few qualifications, and the link there will take you to that. And then I'll also say, as I said before, having the least number of policies is important. I would highly recommend reviewing your policies before going into the cloud. You don't want to, if it was a new thing for you, some people are very nervous for, an earthquake going to the cloud. You don't want to do that and then wonder if some, policy configuration you had was wrong was because you went to the cloud or if it was not. So, do that, clean up beforehand. And once again, just like the groups, if you have policies or setting documents, different domains and directories, once again, they have to be qualified. So for some of the sources of additional information, the first list is wiki articles. That's actually a category, so every wiki article we ever did for policies related is there. A little bit of policy blog. I haven't done too much lately ever since I became the admin team lead, but hopefully going forward I'll do more there. Then we also have here what's called a policy debug decision tree, which is a specific one that I wanted to call out. We've actually did this. I've done some internal presentations for our L2 to help customers debug issues, and it's taken like 2 or 3 hours to do how to debug issues there. What this is meant to be is a self-help tool where we try to take all the efforts and years of experience we have and kind of correlate it down to a simpler flow of how to debug issues. And then once again, here is a link to the general Smart Cloud Notes area, particular to policies. If there's more information you need or other questions you have, I'm here in the lab this afternoon, almost all of tomorrow. I'll be on stage at the developer session on Thursday. Engage us online, and then lastly, please take the time to fill out a evaluation. My first time presenting, so hopefully I'm doing okay. And now questions and answers.
My question has to do with when you need to take and restart the Notes client in order for a policy to be applied. And is there ever a time that it has to be done twice?
Restart the client twice?
Yeah. In other words, it seemed like, and I'm sure this is not the case, but it seemed like I had set a policy. Mm-hmm. The policy was pushed down.
Okay.
I had to restart the client, but it looked like the client had to restart it a second time because it applied the policy, but it didn't seem like it went into effect until I rebooted the client a second time.
I haven't really seen, I've seen the one case, the example I gave with the mail policy settings. I haven't seen twice. But, I can give you my business card and we can debug your situation. But because, once again, every individual setting is consumed differently. And a lot of times what happens to developers, they create, say, an INI for their policy setting. And then later on, when they have the time, they actually move it into the policy. So a lot of times the actual values are stored in little places, and I don't know the semantics of each one. So it might be specific to a certain setting, but we can investigate that.
Well, maybe it has to do with when you register a user for the first time, there is a place to specify a default policy in the person's document.
Yes.
That's what we use. Maybe I should be using a group name instead of hard forced in. I don't know what's that there for in the registration.
No, that's usually a registration policy. Like, for example, you could have an ID vault specified in registration policy. When you register that user, it uploads the vault immediately versus having to wait, normally for, so it's fine going there. But check me after this call, after this meeting, and then I'll work with you on that.
So we're using roaming with a policy, explicit policy, and the situation occurs. I'm afraid I don't actually troubleshoot it. My other admins take care of this for me, so I don't know all the details. But usually we'll get prompted to convert to roaming, and what they'll do is they'll remove the setting in the person document. They'll wait till the next day, and they'll put it back. And what is the precedent or the order there where we could maybe speed that up? Or is there a better way to manage roaming?
The basic flow would be if you change the person document, you would have to force replication between your admin server down to the home mail server, right? You could, rebuild the view if you wanted to do, and then you have to have the user reconnect. So it's kind of manual those steps.
But there's not like an admin P process new is not required. It's really because if it's
that's roaming, so no, it wouldn't be admin P. But it's just that in general, the policy settings have to come down to that mail server, and it could be, I'm not sure what your replication interval is. It could be 5, 15 minutes or whatever.
They're in a cluster. They're all clustered.
Okay.
So it's person doc update and then restart the user's client to force.
Well, do that. Get the policy down. Roaming has a lot of nuances to it because it's kind of like the process, right? It first comes down and start roaming. Work has to happen, right? Replications have to be made. Then after it's, decide that the stubs are full and it's good, then it has to then do an admin P request to say, yes, your roaming's done, and then it goes up to the admin server and gets up in the person document. So roaming's kind of an involved thing, but we can talk back in the lab and get the roaming team and find out if there's a certain way to speed that up for you.
Great, thanks.
Welcome.
It's just like a sanity check for me. With the settings, the first don't set and set first, and whatever those other values are, I can't remember right now. If you want something that's in the notes any that maybe we aren't up on the current version of the directory, so we have to use a desktop policy to set custom the notes any. It seems like that applies that every time a user launches. It might be something, I don't know, like it's okay to drag and drop for EML. There's a notes any setting for that.
Okay.
They can change it in the preferences, but every time they launch, it seems like it goes right back. Now, is that the way it's supposed to?
No. It's supposed to come down once and stay. Usually the thing with INI has been pushed by policy. You can't remove them, so you can once again set it to null or an empty value. Semantics depend upon the particular INI. But no, if that's what's happening to me, let me know, and we can look into that.
Okay. Because what we see is that whatever's in that desktop setting, next launch the person has of notes, it's back to that setting again, which in most cases is okay for us. But there's a couple of say, if they change it, I don't mind if they change it.
Okay.
We just want to start them off with this.
Okay. No, that sounds like a bug, and I haven't heard that. So
Okay.
I can give you my card, and we can...
Yeah, I'm supposed to talk to you about something else anyway.
Okay.
They've lined me up for you.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
This is more of a general question, but I'm just curious if you have any recommendations on migrating from explicit policies to dynamic policies.
Yeah, as I mentioned at one point, the confusion part works in case, right? Because explicit policy and dynamic policies are pretty much the same beast, right? Except for the policy assignment tab. So you could create a group, right? Put a couple people in that group, maybe you're admins, and do the policy synopsis to confirm from your point that they get what they want, and then you can check with them on the end client part. But eventually, what you would do is slowly migrate all the users out of the person documents into that group. And that's how you can do it in steps if you want.
Right.
And then eventually, when they're all out of your person documents, you now want to play dynamic.
Because you could use the same policy, couldn't you? It's just that, if you put them in a group, you could add them to the group and then take them out of the person document.
Right.
It's going to evaluate the person document last.
Right.
As explicit as the last
Right.
last one on the list. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
So, do you have any idea what the hit will be on the network once you assign a policy to a large group of users? I just wonder if there will be a lot of traffic overhead once everybody was...
We haven't. I mean, actually, during 8.5, we found there was a low performance issue right before 8.5 went out because what happened was, as I said, policy updates happened on the authentication stack, and we had a bunch of new policies that were added for like in the security area and other things. And what happened? All these consumers all hit it. We had like policies being invoked like 5 times. So we refactored all that to reuse it and to calm it down, and really haven't had a hit with that. I mean, the best example I can give is that the cloud restarts the servers every night. So every user in the cloud, when they can reconnect, will get a policy hit, and that's the entire cloud.
Wow, okay.
So no, I have never heard of a performance problem with that.
Great, excellent, thanks.
You're welcome.
We have quite a few issues trying to get policies to apply to some clients. We've gone through every troubleshooting step that is documented, and they just don't seem to take.
Okay.
I found some undocumented behavior, is what I would call it,
Okay.
where you can force the policy to come down to the client. Over and above what you have listed here, we just running the inline.
The dying config.
Yeah. If you run that, you'll see 1 or 2 lines come back at the prompt, indicating you think it ran. But you don't really see the actual settings being applied. If you follow that with a space and then anything, in other words, pass it a parameter, the complete policy comes down. And
Well,
I wonder if you could tell me anything about that.
No, I haven't heard that. I mean, you're talking about saying that the policy debug INI, right?
Yeah, we've done all that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No,
But as far as the behavior of that executable, if you pass it anything, any character, you'll get much more output on the command prompt, and you get the policy that actually applies to the client. Otherwise, you can run that on these machines, and they will not take the policy. Period.
Okay.
So I'm trying to understand the code itself and why.
Well,
it behaves that
what I'm
way.
guessing is probably happening there. There's probably a bug in dying config actually that is
Don't
interpreting.
take it out because I need it.
Well, it's probably interpreting a non-parameter,
Yeah.
specified as all.
Right.
And they said there's a whole bunch of things that dying config, takes care of, and it's probably doing an all, and
Yeah, but I might stop down in the lab and talk more about how to just troubleshoot why
Sure.
some clients aren't getting the policies.
Definitely, I said.
Yeah.
And if we have to do a live call, live debug session after the conference, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you, everybody.